greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, Dayton, Tennessee, July 11th, 1925. In a moment, the story.
In the summer of 1925, John Thomas Scopes, a high school science substitute teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, stood trial for teaching evolution. That trial would decide if the theory of evolution had a place in Tennessee public schools as opposed to creationism. The trial revealed two major conflicts between important ideas. The first conflict was between the rights of an individual and the opinion of the majority, and the second was between science and religious belief. Although the trial ended and both sides tolerated the decision of the court, there was no compromise between the prosecution and the defense. Evolution is a scientific theory proposed by Charles Darwin in the late 19th century, which states that man and all other living organisms originated from simpler forms of life over millions of years. Since the theory stated that man evolved from primates, the Scopes trial is often called the monkey trial. Creationism, on the other hand, is a literal belief in the biblical creation story, which states that God created the entire universe in 7 days, including man. These views were perceived to conflict, leading to a movement against evolution in the 1920s, called the anti-evolution movement. The movement soon began to affect state legislature. Laws were passed in multiple states that prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. In Tennessee, John Washington Butler, a state representative, introduced the Butler Act. The act prohibited, quote, the teaching of evolution theory in all the universities, normals, and all other public schools of Tennessee. Many opposed these anti-evolution laws. The American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, a nonprofit organization that supported the rights of individuals, believed that the act violated the academic freedom of teachers. Therefore, they offered to finance anyone who wished to challenge the Butler Act in court. Until the offer from the ACLU, most of the action against evolution was happening in the Tennessee state government, and not in Dayton, a quiet town in Rhea County, Tennessee. However, during the 1920s, the town began to see a decrease in population and economy. So when George Rapalea read the ACLU's offer in the newspaper, he foresaw the publicity and boost in economy his town would receive if he staged such a controversial trial. He shared his ideas with others in the town. They agreed, getting excited at the idea of national attention. As they approached teachers to stand trial, John Scopes, a teacher who opposed the Butler Act, agreed. Scopes was charged with a misdemeanor for teaching evolution to his students from a biology textbook. Just as Rapalea had predicted, the trial attracted a lot of publicity. Reporters and spectators nationwide and even all the way from London arrived to cover the trial. In fact, it was the first court case to ever be broadcasted in live radio. This attention led to many different but equally colorful views of the trial, from political cartoons to poems, songs, dolls, and even trained chimpanzees. The prosecution and defense teams had been created. The two most well-known lawyers were ACLU member Clarence Darrow, a renowned defense lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan, politician and opposer of evolution. The upcoming clash between the two dramatically increased public anticipation for the trial. The arguments had already begun before the trial. Upon their arrival in Dayton, both sides delivered speeches about their arguments.
Clarence Darrow wanted the creation-evolution debate to be part of the trial. He really wanted to put evolution on trial, or rather creation on trial, because he thought creationism was sort of nonsense and wanted to show that evolution really was the explanation for our place on Earth. And William Jennings Bryan also really wanted it to be about creation, evolution. You know, that was his focus in the trial too, although he wanted to expose evolution as an evil, dangerous doctrine that would threaten traditional values. That's where he was coming from.
The trial began on July 10th, 1925, in a hot and packed courtroom in Rhea County Courthouse, with John Ralston, a devout Baptist, as the judge. The defense began their arguments with a motion to quash the indictment. Their initial strategy was to prove the Butler Act to be unconstitutional by claiming that it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Judge Ralston denied the defense's motion, disagreeing with their statements. Both sides then began their arguments. The prosecution stated that Scopes should be convicted since he taught evolution to his students. They then brought in Scopes' students as witnesses. The defense argued that they would also have to prove that evolution conflicted with the Bible. They believed that evolution conflicted with creationism, but not with Christianity as a whole. The defense attempted to prove their point by bringing in experts on evolution as witnesses, but Judge Ralston only allowed the written testimony of one expert to be considered as official evidence. Since Clarence Darrow had no more witnesses, he called William Jennings Bryan to the stand as a Bible expert. The cross-examination that followed was one of the most memorable moments of the trial. Darrow's intentions were to get Bryan to testify against creationism. He asked Bryan about multiple aspects of the Bible, as well as about the creation of the universe. Bryan, in one of his answers, even told Darrow that creation, quote, may have been going on for millions of years. After a heated exchange, the court was adjourned. Many newspapers reported the event to be an embarrassing loss for Bryan. Judge Ralston struck out Bryan's testimony from the record, thinking it irrelevant to the case. It now seemed inevitable to Clarence Darrow that the court would determine Scopes to be guilty, so he directly asked the jury to convict Scopes in order to appeal their decision in the Tennessee Supreme Court. The jury reached a verdict in a mere 9 minutes and found Scopes guilty of violating the Butler Act. Scopes was fined $100 by Judge Ralston for doing so. After his conviction, Scopes made this brief statement: Your Honor, I feel that I have been convicted of violating an unjust statute. I will continue in the future to oppose this law in any way I can. The Scopes trial had officially ended. There were different views on who actually won the argument in the Scopes trial. While the prosecution managed to convict Scopes, the defense believed that the increased awareness about evolution was a victory for them. Clarence Darrow and the other defense lawyers appealed the court's decision in the Tennessee Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court believed the Butler Act to be constitutional and that the wording of the law made it clear that it did not favor any specific kind of religion. Nonetheless, the court overturned Scopes' conviction due to a legal technicality and denied the defense the opportunity for a retrial. Scopes was not convicted, but the Butler Act still remained in Tennessee legislature. In the following years after the Scopes trial, only 2 other anti-evolution laws were passed. However, the Butler Act was not repealed until 1967. In 1968, the Supreme Court ruled that evolution bans violated the Establishment Clause when Susan Epperson, a biology teacher, challenged an anti-evolution law in Arkansas. The time period when the Scopes trial was held affected many aspects of the trial. The 1920s were a period of change. New social trends and behaviors, along with new advancements in science, were common. This change was called modernism.
Well, the Scopes trial was really made for the 1920s. This was a time in which sort of the ideas of modernism are beginning to take hold. That is, that we should test things by science, that progress is something we should be striving for. It was kind of confronting this old notion, a more Victorian traditional notion that we should be guided by our religion, our community. And these two ideas, these two different worldviews clash in this Scope trial, right? So it's a trial because it captures this idea of these two worldviews coming together and clashing. It gets a lot of media attention, and so you get a very extensive coverage in the national papers for something that, if it happened at another time, probably would have been largely ignored.
There were 2 main conflicts in the Scopes trial. The first conflict was between the individual rights of John Scopes and the decision of the majority, the Butler Act. This could be seen when the ACLU offered to challenge the Butler Act to protect Scopes' academic freedom, as well as during the trial, when the defense argued that the Butler Act violated the constitutional rights of Scopes.
And finally, there's this question about whether individual school teachers like John Scopes should have the freedom to teach a course as they see fit. He believed in the theory of evolution, and he was assigned as a substitute teacher to teach biology, and he certainly believed that it should be presented to the students.
The second conflict was between creationism and evolution. This was the reason for the anti-evolution movement, as well as the cross-examination of Bryan as a witness. This conflict was also based on the interpretation of the people involved in the case. Different people had different views on whether these two ideas could coexist. However, because of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, who believed that creationism and evolution were at odds, the conflict became part of the trial. The ideas conflicted, but it was the people that brought this conflict to life. The Scopes trial by no means resolved these conflicts or led to any significant compromise. In fact, these conflicts still continue today and will continue for years to come. A conflict between evolution and the Bible, the trial of a man for teaching evolution in school, and the clash between the 2 greatest lawyers of their time. This is the Scopes trial.